In this video, we will uncover how the Black consciousness movement reignited resistance and why the regime feared it. We will first look at the composition of the Black consciousness movement and the tenets of the Black consciousness philosophy. And then we will take a step-by-step approach to answer a critically discussed type of question. The body paragraphs will be based on the following points: reasons for the formation of the Black consciousness movement, community programs, the Black consciousness movement publications, the promotion of fearlessness, the role of the Black People's Convention, the youth leadership training programs, the role played by the South African student movement, and the Soweto uprising. Towards the end of this video, we will look at how to contextualize the introduction if questions come with quotations. When looking at questions on the Black consciousness movement, it is important to know the key proponents of the movement, the role they played, and the influence their actions had on Black South Africans, as well as be able to explain how their actions were a challenge to the apartheid system. It is equally important to also know how the apartheid regime responded to the threat posed by the BCM. This means that we need to understand what a movement is and the ideas promoted under the Black consciousness movement. A movement is a group of individuals and organizations that share or promote ideas and goals to achieve social, economic, and political change. The Black consciousness movement is therefore a group of Black South African individuals and organizations that promoted the Black consciousness philosophy to achieve social, economic, and political change in South Africa in the 1970s. We will first look at the composition of the Black consciousness movement and the tenets of the Black consciousness philosophy. Under the Black consciousness movement, the key proponents were Steve Biko, Dr. Mampela Rampele, Benny Pichana, Harry Nembwekulu, the South African Student Organization, Black People's Convention, Black Allied Workers Union, South African Student Movement, Soweto Student Representative Council. Under the Black consciousness philosophy, we have tenets like the conscientization to achieve psychological freedom or mental liberation, physical freedom or physical liberation, the rejection of inferiority, the instilling of fearlessness, self-reliance or self-help, the promotion of Black pride, militancy, and Black unity. Questions can come focusing either on the proponents, that is, those who promoted the Black consciousness ideas, or on the tenets of the Black consciousness philosophy. Or questions can focus on both proponents and the tenets. Having highlighted this, let's attempt to answer the following essay question. And the question reads: critically discuss the role played by Steve Biko and the Black consciousness movement in influencing Black South Africans to pose a challenge against the apartheid regime in the 1970s. Use relevant evidence to substantiate your answer. Critically discuss means that we have to look at the role played by the Black consciousness movement from different angles. From one angle, we have to look at the different ways the Black consciousness movement influenced Black South Africans. That is, the ways in which the Black consciousness movement effected a change of mindset in the Black South Africans. From the same angle, we also need to explain how that influence was a challenge to the apartheid regime or apartheid belief system. For us to get the opposing side, as befits a critically discussed type of question, we need to ask if the challenge posed by the Black consciousness movement was one way. That is, if it was only the Black consciousness movement posing a challenge against the apartheid system, without the Black consciousness movement itself facing challenges from the government. Definitely the apartheid government did not just stand idle watching the Black consciousness movement being a threat to its existence. This means that our essay needs to consider the angle from which we see the apartheid regime ruthlessly responding to the threat posed by the Black consciousness movement as evidence to prove that indeed the Black consciousness movement was a challenge to the apartheid system. Obviously, if there was no response from the regime, then it suggests otherwise, that the Black consciousness movement was no threat to it if the government was not bothered. It is important to emphasize that any argument presented in each paragraph in the essay should be backed by evidence. So we'll start our essay with the introduction saying this: it is beyond doubt that indeed Steve Biko and the Black consciousness movement played a big role in influencing Black South Africans to pose a big threat against the apartheid regime in the 1970s. Note that by adding the word big, we are trying to quantify the measure of the Black consciousness movement's actions and influence in going against the regime. Also worth noting is the substitution of the word challenge with the word threat, without changing the meaning of the statement to demonstrate our understanding of the question. Since we are discussing in this essay, we need to introduce the counter view, which has not been given within the statement contained in the question. And so we say, however, the government also responded harshly to the Black consciousness movement activists. Yes, we have taken our stance, which we contextualized and introduced two sides to be discussed in the essay. What then do we intend to do in our essay? So we write our statement of intent. This essay seeks to critically examine the role played by the Black consciousness movement and Steve Biko, as well as the impact their actions had on Black South Africans and on the apartheid regime, and in so doing, point out how the apartheid government brutally responded to the spreading influence of the Black consciousness movement. The first paragraph will provide the reasons why the Black consciousness movement was formed. The Black consciousness movement was formed by Steve Biko to fill in the political void left by the burning of the South African Communist Party, the African National Congress, the Pan-Africanist Congress, and the subsequent arrest of ANC leaders after being discovered at their headquarters at Liliesleaf Farm north of Pretoria in 1963. Black South Africans were left with no political representation. The struggle spirit was dying as blacks were losing hope of ever overcoming apartheid. Steve Biko also believed that blacks were playing a role in their own oppression. As a result, the creation of the Black consciousness movement aimed to psychologically free blacks from inferiority complexes that worked in favor of the apartheid regime, to instill a strong sense of pride and to revive the struggle against apartheid, as well as politically conscientize Black South Africans and promote self-reliance. The fact that the Black consciousness movement was formed with the aim of reigniting the fire to end apartheid and the Black consciousness bid to liberate blacks from inferiority complexes, which had made it easy for the perpetuation of apartheid, shows that the formation of the Black consciousness movement was in itself a threat to the existence of the apartheid system. The apartheid government had thought that it had dealt with black political activism when it banned ANC and PAC and arrested leaders, but the Black consciousness movement was to undo that. So our link in our pure approach becomes, these reasons clearly show that the Black consciousness movement was formed to combat apartheid and dismantle its belief system. The point to be introduced in the second paragraph is Black community programs for self-reliance. So we have to write this point in the form of a sentence. The Black consciousness movement established Black community programs as self-help programs run by blacks for blacks. The emphasis was self-reliance amongst Black South African communities. This was evidenced by the expulsion of Themba Sono from the movement after he had advised cooperation with the white liberals and black leaders of homelands. Although it was recorded as a forced resignation on the 3rd of July 1972 before being expelled, it was in essence an expulsion. Self-reliance was the reason why Steve Biko formed the South African Student Organization after breaking away from the predominantly white NUSAS. There was to be no contact with white liberals. Having mentioned community programs, there is need to mention a few examples. Community self-help programs included providing clean water, shelter, health services, building small dams, construction of school buildings, assisting relocated communities, and establishing home-based industries such as bricklaying. Names of such programs include Ituseng Community Health Center, Zimele Trust Fund, and Leatherworks in Zinyoka. One popular example is Zanempilo Community Health Center, whose success inspired a similar establishment, Solempilo, in Natal. Naming these projects serve as evidence of their existence. But what impact did these projects have on Black South Africans? And in what way were they a challenge to the apartheid system? These helped blacks to determine their own needs and realize their own potential. Ultimately, this posed a challenge to the apartheid regime since the projects mobilized people to rally behind the Black consciousness movement to oppose the government, and the Black consciousness movement won the trust and confidence of Black South Africans. We have to bear in mind that the apartheid belief system viewed blacks as children who could not do anything on their own. So the projects went against those beliefs as blacks met their own needs through these programs without any help from whites. The apartheid system took away black South Africans' dignity. However, the projects countered this. These projects improved the physical conditions and helped villagers gain a greater sense of human dignity, and an incredible feeling of self-pride and self-worth spread amongst black South Africans. So where is the evidence to prove that the Black Consciousness community programs were a threat to the apartheid system? Evidence to prove that the activities under the Black community programs had an impact which was not desired by the government and thus challenged the government is the fact that a year after the introduction of these programs, Bokwe Mafuna, the Black community programs executive for Johannesburg branch, and Steve Biko, the Black community programs executive for King Williamstown branch, were banned in March 1973. The restrictions on them were widened to stop the activities of the Black community programs. The fact that by 1974, the 20 Black Consciousness Movement activists who had been banned were involved in community programs shows how much of a threat the programs were to the regime. If the programs were not a challenge to the apartheid system, then there wouldn't have been any need on the government's part to engage its machinery to stop them. Steve Biko and the Black Consciousness Movement produced and distributed among Black South Africans publications such as journals, newsletters, flyers, and community newspapers which revived cultural, literary, and political activism. Struggle literature was published in the Black Review, of which Steve Biko was the editor. These publications sought to correct the distorted representation of Black community as passive and incapable of intellectual production. This clearly indicates that the publications challenged the apartheid belief that blacks were intellectually inferior. We then need to provide examples of such publications. The publications included the Black Viewpoint, Black Perspectives, SASO Newsletter, Black Review, Black Voice, and Creativity in Development. But what impact did these publications have on Black South Africans? Through these activities, the Black Consciousness Movement improved literacy among Black people by political, economic, and social conscientization. The publication and distribution thus also were ways of Black self-assertiveness and promoted public debates on social and political issues affecting Blacks. This in turn developed their thinking and came up with creative strategies on how to engage with the broader community and organize against the system. The challenge posed to the regime through media is evident in the regime's banning of 18 Black consciousness media in 1977. If the publications were not a challenge, then there wouldn't have been any need for the government to ban the publications. The government response reaffirms the stance taken in the introduction that the Black Consciousness Movement was indeed a challenge to the apartheid system. The Black Consciousness Movement also wanted Black South Africans to be fearless and openly challenge the apartheid government. So in our next paragraph, we talk about how the Black Consciousness Movement reduced the fear in Black people and promoted self-assertiveness and fearlessness to achieve psychological and physical liberation. The Black Consciousness Movement diminished or reduced the fear in Black people and promoted self-assertiveness and fearlessness to achieve psychological and physical liberation. Steve Biko and the Black Consciousness Movement were outspoken in their criticism of government actions and influenced Black South Africans to do the same. The Black Consciousness Movement made Black South Africans to openly speak their minds and fearlessly challenge the apartheid regime. But where is the evidence to prove that Black South Africans became fearless due to the influence of the Black Consciousness Movement? The influence of the Black Consciousness ideas in making Black South Africans fearless is seen in the increase in nationwide strikes in 1973 by Black workers such as the Durban 1973 strikes, which were organized by the Black Allied Workers Union, BAU. How did this affect the apartheid government? These strikes helped cripple the apartheid economy. The open defiance by the South African Student Organization and the Black People's Convention in 1974 demonstrates the instilled fearlessness. In 1974, SASO and BPC organized a mass public rally to celebrate Frelimo's victory over Portuguese colonialism in Durban in defiance of government ban on public meetings. The rally attracted a crowd of over 5,000 people. Because of the threat they posed, SASO and BPC members were beaten, arrested, detained without trial for months and later charged under the Terrorism Act. The fearlessness and defiance is also seen in the nationwide student protests, burning of schools and government offices in the days following the Soweto massacre. Protests and clashes with police spread to 160 black townships, and after the killing of Steve Biko in 1977, protests intensified, thereby proving that the Black Consciousness movement and Steve Biko inspired black South Africans to confront the regime fearlessly. Take note that the mere fact that Steve Biko was arrested and afterwards killed by the apartheid police is self-evidence of his direct influence on black South African youths who rose on 16 June 1976. Steve Biko traveled throughout the country putting forward his black consciousness ideas and became the embodiment of defiance and fearlessness by refusing to be intimidated by authority, no matter what the state did to him. He preached the need for both psychological and physical liberation or political independence. The creation of the Black People's Convention as a political organization had to achieve this physical liberation. The Black People's Convention condemned foreign countries working with the apartheid government. It was the first national political organization after 1960 to take a strong stance of non-participation in the apartheid system. This was a threat to the apartheid regime as it soiled the international image of the South African government and helped intensify pressure from the international community onto the apartheid government. The Black People's Convention also helped organize the pro-Frelimo rallies, otherwise known as Viva Frelimo rallies, in 1974. The Black People's Convention was an umbrella political body embracing different organizations that shared black consciousness ideas. This means that the Black People's Convention played the role of unifying blacks and mobilizing all blacks into fighting the regime. The Black People's Convention also advocated for repossession of national land by engaging in acts of sabotage, which were mainly done underground, targeting apartheid facilities and infrastructure. Political conscientization and the rekindling of anti-apartheid activism at grassroots level was at the forefront of the movement's projects, so we need to explain how this was done. The Black Consciousness movement, Steve Biko, and Benny Pichana were heavily involved in the leadership training and youth development projects. Steve Biko, together with SASO's national organizer Harry Nengwekulu, ran leadership seminars. These, coupled with formation schools, weekend education schemes, as well as weekend and holiday camps, served as training grounds where students debated societal issues and learned organizational strategies. A number of layers of leadership were created in these training programs to ensure continuity of the organization, with new leaders readily available to replace cadres who might be banned. This would be a challenge as the government would find it difficult to get rid of organizations affiliated to the Black Consciousness movement. What problems did this cause for the apartheid government? This yielded organization of significant events that caused headaches and sleepless nights for the apartheid regime. This is evidenced by the fact that the leadership training programs resulted in the formation of the South African Student Movement, which organized student representative council committees at high schools, such as the famous Soweto Student Representative Council, which in turn organized the June 1976 uprising against Afrikaans as the medium of instruction and the inferior education system. Further evidence of how the Black Consciousness movement influenced the youths through their leadership training programs is the fact that many leaders that emerged in the 1980s in UDF, ANC and the trade unions were activists that had cut their political teeth in the Black Consciousness movement, examples of which are Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma and Cyril Ramaphosa. SASO had also influenced students in high schools through debating societies to fight for their rights. The Black Consciousness movement encouraged youths to form their own organizations, and hence the formation of the South African student movement to protest against inferior black education, and so campaigned against choral music competitions, which they said took students away from their studies. The South African student movement was also against beer halls and shebeens, which they said were destroying their parents and communities. The fact that the South African student movement was aligned with various Black consciousness movement organizations is self-evidence of the influence of Black consciousness ideas on students, as the South African student movement supported student boycotts of exams and walkouts. The South African student movement was central in politicizing the youths and encouraging them to take action. It had formed the Soweto Student Representative Council (SSRC) and together were responsible for the 16 June 1976 demonstrations. It also demanded that the government talk with three black leaders, Nelson Mandela, Robert Sobukwe, and Steve Biko. The government responded by cracking down on the leaders through arrests and detention that resulted in many deaths, like Steve Biko's death, and many unexplained disappearances. Further influence of the Black consciousness movement is seen in the fact that Black consciousness ideas changed Black South African thinking among adults and youths in various corners of the country. One of the main tenets of Steve Biko's Black consciousness philosophy had been psychological emancipation from Black inferiority complexes. He wanted blacks to do away with their submissive attitude towards whites and get rid of the feeling of inferiority towards them. This is expressed in Steve Biko's most famous words: "The most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed." The impact and influence of Steve Biko's ideas is seen in the Soweto uprising and the protests in the months that followed. The inferior form of education, coupled with the introduction of Afrikaans, set Black South Africans to only be good for inferior jobs, and inferior jobs meant inferior wages that would make them remain in poverty and thus occupy an inferior position in the society. Being set up for such a life is what the students rejected. Young blacks refused to be held in an inferior position. Students under the South African student movement confronted the Bantu education policy designed to prepare them to be second-class citizens with a restricted role in the economy. The rejection of the Afrikaans language was a rejection of inferiority. The language was unfamiliar to most teachers and learners and would result in them failing and subsequently seem to be intellectually inferior. The Black consciousness movement had made people aware that their culture held intrinsic value and should not be forced to accept another language or culture. Through the leadership training programs, the Black consciousness movement and South African Student Organization taught students to plan and organize, and this was evidenced by the planning and organization of the Soweto uprising on 16 June 1976. The Black consciousness movement thus gave the youths hope, strength, and courage to challenge the regime. Black consciousness ideas turned the youths into being militant. The youths who had been influenced by the Black consciousness movement became militant and were an immediate danger to the apartheid government. The youths were barricading, stoning, engaging in acts of arson and killing in the months following the uprising and after Steve Biko's death in 1977. About 14,000 students left the country into exile and rejoined Umkhonto weSizwe and EPLA forces for military training. The liberation struggle against apartheid had been injected with militant young blood and a new life. Internally, the Black consciousness movement renewed resistance. The apartheid regime responded by increasing militarized repression. The government even made forced conscriptions to expand security forces. The whites who resisted conscription were labeled traitors. From the above given arguments, it is conclusive to reaffirm that the Black consciousness movement and Steve Biko played a critical role in changing the mindset and actions of Black South Africans as well as in challenging the apartheid regime. All this is evidenced by the increase in violent protests in the 1970s, the banning of the Black Consciousness Movement, the banning of its members, organizations, media, and the banning of the mere expression of Black consciousness ideas, coupled by the arrest and the killing of Steve Biko in 1977. Having completed our essay, we now need to look at how to contextualize introductions for questions with quoted statements. When a question includes a statement presented as a quotation, your task is not to simply copy or restate the quote. Instead, you must interpret its meaning and use that interpretation to guide your contextualization. Why do we do this? Quoted statements often carry implicit ideas or perspectives. That is to say, the ideas are not directly stated. Secondly, contextualization requires understanding the quote's significance, not just its wording. Take for example, given the following question, the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Discuss how this statement by Steve Biko reflects the objectives of the Black Consciousness Movement in South Africa in antagonizing the apartheid ideology, while following the expectations of the marking guideline, which stipulates that there should be a stance which is contextualized and a statement of intent. We cannot contextualize by saying that it is beyond doubt that the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. This is wrong. The statement can be roughly interpreted as referring to the psychological liberation, rejection of inferiority to effect the political mobilization of Black South Africans to go against the apartheid machinery and its belief system to attain physical liberation. It means that we have to use this interpretation, our knowledge of who said the words, his intentions for saying the words, as well as the knowledge of the population group being targeted by the words. Our contextualization should then sound like this. It is beyond doubt that Steve Biko and the Black Consciousness Movement pushed for psychological liberation, rejection of inferiority, and the political mobilization of Black South Africans to go against the apartheid machinery and its belief system. As a second example, the statement, "Black men, you are on your own," can be interpreted as a call for Black South Africans to take action and rely on themselves and not on the whites to meet their own needs, to end apartheid, to regain their pride and dignity, and so on. And this is self-reliance. So we cannot say that it is indisputable to say that black men, you are on your own. This would again be wrong. We need to use the interpretation to inform our contextualization and say, it is indisputable to say that the Black Consciousness Movement focused on self-reliance in mobilizing Black South Africans to challenge the apartheid system in the 1970s.